Good morning. I'm Jim Marshall. I'm the president of the Institute of Peace. I want to welcome you all here to the Institute. Many of you are already familiar with our work. As the name implies, we're interested in furthering peace, and we do so globally. We are involved in an awful lot of countries. Our employees are regularly in harm's way trying to advance the cause of peace. And of course, we've been actively involved in Afghanistan for a number of years. I came to this job in July, roughly. I was actually sworn in September of last year. But I'd come from teaching at Princeton University for a year, and then prior to that, being a member of Congress throughout the period of time that we've been actively engaged in Afghanistan. I made about 15 trips to Afghanistan during that period of time. I was a member of the Armed Services Committee. I'm a Vietnam War veteran. I'm somebody who's very familiar with the hard side of things and the limits of American military force. In fact, I taught a course at Princeton on that very subject. And as a member of Congress, visiting Afghanistan, it was very, very apparent to me and to other members of various congressional delegations going to Afghanistan that the political transition and political the strength of the government that evolved in Afghanistan would be determinant of the future of Afghanistan. That yes, there is a military component to all of this, but without an appropriate political environment for the country, it was going to be very difficult for Afghanistan to succeed. Today we are 1 year out from elections that are critically important, an election that is critically important in the history of Afghanistan's maturation politically. For quite some time here at the Institute of Peace, we've been concerned about this upcoming political transition and have been arguing that it is at least as significant, if not more significant, than the military transition, the drawdown that's about to occur. I published an article about this 6 months ago in the New York Times. At that time, traveling in Afghanistan, we were talking about, well, we've got 2 years. It's just 2 years to go before the elections. And the reality was only about 18 months to go before the elections. Time had just been slipping by, slipping by, slipping by. Visiting a broad cross-section of Afghan leadership, political elites, individuals, civil elites, I regularly ask the question, what's the single most important thing that could be done to further the future of Afghanistan in a very positive way? And the consistent response, 90% of the people who responded, and this is back in September of this year, get the political transition right. They weren't focused on the military side of things, they were focused on the political transition. I'll have an op-ed, as I mentioned, coming out in Foreign Policy later today, and one of the observations that I make in that op-ed is that here in Washington, for months and months and months now, the principal focus where Afghanistan is concerned, some chatter about talking with the Taliban, but the principal focus has been residual force levels. And I'll just make this assertion. If the residual force level is 8,000, or the residual force level is 13,600, or it's 20,000, will make utterly no difference at all unless the political transition goes reasonably well. If the political transition does not go well, and Afghanistan unfortunately descends into chaos, those troop levels won't make any difference. The other observation I'll make is that the choice between a troop level of, say, 8,000 and a troop level of 20,000, if they're United States military forces, is a choice between X and X plus 15 or $20 billion per year in additional costs. 12,000 troops. I'd say 15 to 20 depending upon how kinetic things are. And yet, last summer, when the UN and the Independent Election Commission came up with a proposal for a way forward that would assure free and fair, credible elections in Afghanistan, if I recall correctly, that the price tag was $100 million, and we were all carping about it. We ultimately decided that was too expensive. So you've got coming up this existential event from my perspective, and it's the appropriate political transition in Afghanistan. And we're arguing about troop levels with billions and billions, tens of billions of dollars hanging around him, and we're not just sort of pouring money on the political transition side. We ought to be doing that. As I put it in the op-ed, the amount of money we could credibly spend to try to make sure that the transition, the political transition, works well is utterly paltry compared to how much money we're talking about in the less relevant choice of precise troop levels left after the transition. I've had my say. I've taken too much of time. You can tell I'm a little passionate about the subject. I'm delighted that you're all here. We've got a great panel, and I'm going to turn it over to Andrew Wilder, who does a wonderful job leading our AFPAC programs. He is absolutely the right person to be leading a discussion like this. And Andrew, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. It is an exciting panel day with an exciting panel here. An excellent group of people to talk about this important topic. Like Jim, it's a topic I'm fairly passionate about, and I think you'll also know that it's something that many of you are familiar faces here. It's a topic that USIP has been trying to highlight. Now, if we're going on to 2 years, just the really important need to focus on the political transition in Afghanistan. And I think it's very easy to be skeptical about that. And, you know, I was just in Afghanistan in March, and I heard lots of skepticism and concerns about whether it could be possible, and the intentions of, you know, whether it was the Afghan government, you know, how committed are they to actually moving forward with elections, but also skepticism to what extent, in terms of for the U.S. and the international community more broadly, the elections are actually high on our priority list. But I am actually encouraged now that I do think, certainly for the U.S. government, that there is now a recognition that they are important. And I think and you know, with 1 year to go as of today, I think it's a very timely time to be focusing now on what actually needs to be done. And what are the key communication messages? I mean, I think that's an important piece of it, too. How do we actually communicate to the Afghans that for the U.S. government, the elections are very top on our priority list? Because I think, as Jim noted, certainly it's very hard for me to see how, if we don't have a credible election that leads to a legitimate outcome, how the security transition or the economic transition are going to actually move forward in Afghanistan. So when we do think about how difficult it's going to be and how fraught with many challenges, and it's, you know, we need to also bear in mind, well, to me, the challenges of holding credible elections actually pale in comparison to the challenges of actually dealing with the consequences of an illegitimate holding on to power in Afghanistan or an illegitimate transfer of power in Afghanistan. So I think we need to compare an environment with difficult options. Elections are certainly, from my perspective, the best of them. So again, thank you all for coming, and I think we do have an excellent panel of people who are all highly qualified to talk on this topic. You have the biographies in front of you. I don't want to take too much time going through them in detail, but we're going to start off with Nader Naderi, who's eminently qualified to speak on this topic. Nader is one of Afghanistan's most prominent civil society activists, human rights activists, but also very strongly committed and active on promoting the elections agenda in Afghanistan. And in particular, from his current position as executive chairman of the Free and Fair Elections Foundation in Afghanistan. But Nader also served as commissioner on the Afghan Human Rights Commission. He was one of the elected delegates to the first emergency Loya Jirga. He was one of the people selected to represent civil society at the Bonn conference. So I could go on, but I won't. You have it written in front of you. He will lead off the discussion. He will be followed by Hosai Wardak, we are extremely pleased to have as a senior Afghan expert here at USIP for the next 6 months. Hosai also has extensive experience as a leader in civil society movements in Afghanistan. She is the executive director of from my perspective, Afghanistan's a fabulous NGO there called Equality for Peace and Democracy, with one of USIP's partners. Prior to working with EPD, Hosai has also worked for UNICEF in Azerbaijan and has a long background working on social development issues and human rights issues in Afghanistan. So looking forward to having Hosai speak. Jose will be followed by Scott Smith. Scott's our Deputy Director for Afghan Programs in Afghanistan and also has extensive experience working on elections in Afghanistan, starting with, he was very actively involved in the, from the UN side. He spent 13 years working for the UN, mostly focusing on Afghanistan. In that role, he worked actively as the desk officer during the 2004 and 5 elections. He's written an excellent book on the 2004 and 2009 elections. But in addition to working at the headquarters level, Scott was the special assistant to the Secretary General Special Representative in Afghanistan from 2009 to 2010, which many of you will recall was quite an interesting time in terms of electoral politics in Afghanistan. And Scott had a bird's eye view of, or fly on the wall, or perspective on that very interesting election. Last but not least, Scott Warden, who defected from USIP and went over to the dark side, where he is now a senior advisor on governance issues at USAID, but where he's primarily focusing currently also on the elections. But in addition to his time at USAID and USIP, where he was actively involved and helped very much at USIP in getting the elections issue high onto our agenda here, he also has a very practical, on-the-ground experience of dealing with elections and some of the problems of elections when he sat as one of the 2 international commissioners on the Electoral Complaints Commission for the 2009 election. So again, everyone here brings very on-the-ground experience dealing with elections in Afghanistan. So without taking more time, I'm going to turn it over to Nader, and I've asked each of the speakers to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. And then that will leave us at least 45 minutes at the end for discussion. So over to you, Nader.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be again here at the USIP. It seems that I'm spending the first days of each time that I'm in Washington here at the USIP. I just arrived an hour ago, and if I say unrelevant things, please count it as part of my jet lag or being sleep, as it starts in Kabul to go to bed.
We'll try to keep you awake.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Andrew, and the USIP to mark a day that is so significant in the future of Afghanistan. A year from now, Afghans go again for the 3rd time to choose and select or elect their next president. That is a significant step forward for the country's future, not only because it's happening in a time where the international troops are going to withdraw, or the withdrawal will be very much underway or progressed, but it is because if Afghans make that political transition, they're going to gradually and slowly walk on the right path of stability. It will enable them to stand on their own feet on the political path, where it will also enable them to prevent a return of the terrorists and also to prevent the country to become a safe haven, not only for the terrorists, but also for the wider international criminal groups. Let me begin briefly to present you with the current political context that we are in, just entering to a year of electoral cycle. At this stage, it's a very vibrant and active political environment back in Kabul. The news out of Kabul mostly dominates security incidents, and it's always very negatively portrayed. But it is not all doom and gloom. It's not all about those scenes of violence that are being projected rightly on the media scene. So it is there is a very vibrant and active political environment. Of course, security and terrorist attacks continue to create an anxiety and fear. Just 2 days ago, most of you have read or heard about one of the very deadliest attack in one of the provinces against civilians, which killed and injured more than 130 civilians. So that's still a sign there. We also see an increasing sign of uncertainty about the future of Afghan and international, especially the future of partnership between Afghanistan and the United States. That is actually driven by the fact that the delays were being seen in signing of bilateral security agreement, slower progress in that direction. In addition to that, the rhetoric from Kabul and President Karzai is adding to that level of uncertainty. Third, we do see an increasing or emerging signs of circles closer to President Karzai feeling not anymore much obliged to follow what President Karzai wants or wish. Some of them trying to distance to some extent themselves, and therefore some of them already showing a sign that they want to stand alone on their own in terms of running for the office. These early signs of President Karzai's authority with the election nearing, reducing is emerging. With that, on the elections, there are two major dominant discussions right now happening in Kabul. One is focused much more on the technical side of the election. The technical side, to begin with, is much more on the law on elections, the legal framework of the election. Most of you may have followed that a new legislation being submitted, or a draft bill is submitted to the parliament. The positive note there is that there is an active advocacy and lobbying of both political parties and members of civil society to see the draft or the bill, electoral bill, is not the way that the government is presenting. There's an active lobbying inside the parliament and outside also. The media is much more engaged in discussing those issues that are sensitive and important and points of concern for the public. Along with that, we do see women groups are organizing themselves in a much more aggressive way to pursue an agenda where the electoral law will preserve not only their quota share, the granted seats into the coming elections and into the future parliament, but also their more increased level of political participation. 2 days ago, a coalition of Afghan women advocacy group for political participation just launched their sets of recommendations about the election law. And it was a very thoroughly looked from a gender perspective of the electoral law. That group is composed of very active parliamentarians, members of civil society, women groups, and media. These are all positive trends that are happening. Political parties are coming again with sets of their lobbying and advocacy agenda and are spending time in the parliament. And that's, I count it as one of the very important progress that we haven't seen it in the past, but currently we do increasingly see a realization and maturity in the Afghan political parties that the battle on these technical issues are going to be fought in the parliament, and we do see that happening. Of course, when we look to the past few months, the consensus that were built around electoral reform on the technical side of the election is also among a large number of political parties and civil society organizations could be counted as a positive step forward on the technical side. But there are risks, of course, out there if most of these efforts do not give results. On the technical side, the first risk is a delay in the adoption of the electoral law. The risk attached with that is that, again, the draft law or the bill that's submitted to the parliament will be issued through a presidential decree by the president, which undermine that sense of democratic participation and the role of the legislature in this critical time as we go for the presidential election. The second risk that we see in that delay is the election commission appointments of the commissioners of the election commission. There's already a decrease or a higher degree of lack of confidence into the election commission itself because of what has happened in 2010. If this delay with the electoral, in the adoption of the electoral law, cause a lack of a different mechanism that guarantees transparently appointment of the election commissioners, it's going to have negative consequences, and therefore we consider that as major risk. We also see on the technical side a major risk in terms of the voter registration. The voter registration had a delay of almost a month. It was supposed to start in April. The Election Commission just announced a delay of a month to begin with on 26th of May. That delay, with already high degree of suspicion in most of the political parties about the process of voter registration, is going to contribute to the level of risk that's already attached with the technical side of the process. On the political side, however, positive trends are that more and more political elites and political parties are realizing that they cannot anymore run for a presidential election the same way as they did in the past, which was mostly framed around individuals. There is a realization much more now that in this election, agendas and also the team and group of people would matter the most for the public. The realization that they need to develop future platforms, future agendas, and their vision for the country, and to start a year ahead of the election, is something that makes the current political environment different from the past two times that we have had presidential elections. Along with that, the discussion about the presidential election and election itself is now a dominant part of the public discourse. You go to any average Afghan gathering, the first thing that starts is the election and who is going to be the next president and what kind of agenda that president will have. How different that next administration will be from the current administration. What are the challenges? In every single household, over dinner table and lunch tables, you will hear discussion about the election. The risks that are attached with on the political side, there are a few major risks that we see. The continued insecurity, the attacks the way they are happening now, the lack of progress on the political settlement or the talks, the negotiation with the Taliban, which all the indicators show it doesn't give us any hope for progress in that direction, and that will be a major factor in the future election. The second major risk on the political front is that potential candidates so far have not emerged, and we have 1 year to go. If in the coming few months these building consensus attempts by the different political parties do not manage to present a stronger candidate, it will open a way for one of the major risks that we see, an attempt for extension into the term of President Karzai. There we do see some of the indicators that are negatively taking realities on ground, that some members of the government justifies an increased insecurity, an absence of a potential or number of potential candidates who can generate much more of public interest and mobilize the public behind them, is somehow giving away to a potential calling of a Lojirga. There is some discussion about that, or calling for the current constitution setup to not be able to operate properly, and therefore to call another setup of national unity government. These are major risks that are attached there. The consequences of these risks is to a degree that neither Afghans nor our international partners would be able to afford. And therefore, I very much endorse what Andrew and the President of the USIP said about the way forward. No matter what's going to happen in terms of the need for an increased level of logistical, military, and political support to this election, it is a must that need to be together, we as Afghans, to provide for that and to fight for that, and we expect our international partners also to contribute, because simply there is no other solution for Afghans and our international partners to succeed in this way forward. I would stop here. I may exceeded my time.
Thank you. Actually, second, we're going to go to Jose.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much indeed. Well, elections, I think not only is a topic of a discussion over dinner and lunch table back in Kabul, but I think it's a topic which has been discussed with the international community almost every day, and those who are involved in Afghanistan one way and the other. Two things which actually be considered as a milestone in terms of having successful election could possibly be the security forces being able to protect voting, and the Afghans, the second one, of course, accepting the results of the elections. These are the two important elements, actually, that it would contribute not only to the successful process of elections, but I think also to give a legitimacy to the whole process as such. And I think, now they're very well mentioned in terms of what are the political structure for that, what are the issues and the developments happening on the process side, on the technical side. But I still believe, whenever we have elections in Afghanistan, it always starts pretty late. The preparation and the whole arrangement for that is always very late, while it should have actually started when we were done with the previous elections. And I think, that giving a shorter window for the whole preparation around the country would sometimes, overlook very important steps which are actually needs to be taken in order to ensure a transparent election process. I would actually focus more in terms of the local and grassroots level people who are there. Yes, we have all the developments happening around the election law, which has been, very unique in the sense that there were joint advocacy efforts from both civil society and parliament together in order to ensure that we are actually having a proper legislative ground for the upcoming elections. However, the worry that I have is that it's such an important document, a bill which is still lying with the parliament, and yet nobody would like to talk about it and to say when they are going to actually discuss about this whole issue. And I think, giving the experiences that with the parliamentarians normally, that they would obviously looking for their own personal interests as such, that is actually worrying the general people on the ground, saying that why is it that, nobody would like to talk about, the election law, which, something which is extremely important for the country as such. The other issue is that, with all the uncertainties political at the political level that we are having, how far we will be able actually to encourage Afghans to come and vote this time. We have, first of all, the process which starts late. We have, certain steps that we have not even started, including the voter registrations. We don't know what exactly political parties are actually wanting. Nobody would like to step forward and to say, look, we have created this coalition, and we would like to step forward to say that we are forming a group and we will probably be, running for the next elections. Still, and together that with insecurity, will we be able actually to have a large number of voters to come out and cast vote on that particular day? And I think for me, I take it as a very positive step, looking at the situation of women, that this coalition could manage to step forward and to talk about, inclusion of women, the quota for women, not only in the bill itself, but as well as in terms of, the IEC structure. These are very important steps, but I think it's very important that we have to ensure that how can we get those women to come out and vote. And I think, one of the areas which I can see is completely overlooked is the public awareness in terms of voting. And I think, pretty much that we are focusing in terms of how to vote and what are the technical perspectives. It should be also passed on to people saying why we have to vote. And I think it's important that we have to tell them that yes, it's the way that it's going to work, but how they can actually hold their candidates accountable, given the fact that it's going to be both presidential and provincial councils election, which is very much important. I think in terms of a step forward, we have to do as much as we are doing in terms of the advocacy grounds. We are, working in terms of election bill, the legislative grounds. I think, it's important that, political parties have to come together and talk to civil society in terms of what are their demands and what is it that they can actually expect, and what are the expectations of civil societies from these political parties, given the fact that they will actually be coming into power one day. The other important thing is that beyond 2014 and presidential elections, we are going to have parliamentary elections in 2015. And these are important for us in terms that presidential election will happen with less financial resources than the times which we used to have, and obviously with almost, non-presentation of the international forces in the country. But how is it that we can learn from the elections in 2014 and well ahead of time prepare for the parliamentary elections which we are going to expect in 2015? What is it that we can work with youth in Afghanistan in terms of encouraging them and explaining the whole process for that? So in terms of a step forward and obviously as a way forward, I think it's important that there should, the whole process for the 2014 elections should be very closely monitored. Both in terms of transparency and the fairness of the election, but as well as to learn some lessons on the ground for the 2015 elections and after that. There has to be an extensive and sustainable work in terms of reaching to Afghan youth and population as such. And that could be that how can we actually start right now from high schools, from universities, and actually talk in terms of be a part of a curricula to talk about the elections. What are the importance of elections and how is it that they, their vote are going to count? So many people will say, oh, we know who's going to be the president, so why do I have to vote as such? We know what's going to be the security situation. The fact that, so many people were able, to have proxy votes. I've seen, a situation where, somebody would come up, the only time I keep on saying, that an Afghan will say that they have many daughters are actually around the elections because they will bring so many cards and say, oh, my daughters cannot come to the voting and polling stations, so I'm just voting on their behalf. How is it that actually we can avoid something like that? What is it that we can actually reach to people to see how much it matters actually that they will take their own cards and come and cast their vote? So I believe, that we have to learn from whatever we are having in the process right now and prepare for something and a solid ground for the future elections. I'll stop in here and.
Thank you, Scott. He grabs his water.
Thank you. I want to talk about the 2009 elections, whether we've learned the right lessons from them, whether we understand them correctly, so that we can better understand what's about to happen in 2014. The prevailing narrative of 2009, especially here in Washington, I've discovered, is that President Karzai engineered a massively fraudulent election to secure his re-election. The international community, in particular the UN, turned a blind eye to this fraud. Karzai was re-elected, delegitimized. In the meantime, Afghan institutions showed themselves to be incapable of really holding elections, and the next elections are therefore probably sure to be fraudulent. That's the prevailing narrative. I would take issue with every single assertion within it, which is what I'm going to do now. The first thing is, just from a personal point of view, I should state my own biases. The narrative, I think, largely became cemented in people's minds as a result of a very public and bitter dispute between Kai Eide, who was my boss, as Andrew pointed out, and Peter Galbraith, who was his deputy, who had very different views about how we should handle the fraud once it became clear how massive this fraud was. Eventually, through a series of circumstances that are too convoluted to bother to explain, the Secretary General dismissed Peter Galbraith, and from that moment he began a very public campaign in the op-ed pages of various newspapers and on television that basically began to lay out precisely the elements of this narrative. And I don't think it's really shifted very much. And it was, I have to say, a very effective narrative, because when I came home for Christmas, finally, after 4 months of working on this crisis, my mother said, well, why didn't you listen to that nice Peter Galbraith? So I had to tell her what I'm about to tell you. The first point is, I think it's important to understand, especially as we plan for these next elections, that not all of the fraud that was carried out on behalf of President Karzai, I think, was necessarily ordered by President Karzai. The key to understanding this is that the Afghan president, by virtue of the constitution, has basically the power to appoint almost every public official in the country, which meant everybody who was responsible for the election, on the security side or on the IEC side, was directly or indirectly appointed by the president. And they may have been overzealous in their own desire to keep their jobs. And the fact is, this fraud served nobody, least of all Karzai, as I'll explain. It was embarrassing. It was blatant. And it did undermine Karzai's legitimacy, obviously. And in the gallows humor, after going through a process like this, we sort of made the joke that what we need to do is have a much better training program so that the next time the electoral and security officials commit fraud, they do it in a slightly more subtle way. They could have achieved the same outcome. And I think Karzai was probably fairly confident that he would win without needing that much fraud because he had lined up most of the brokers behind him. The opposition was still sort of split. He controlled the powers of the state, which definitely he used to influence the election. And I think the only thing that was bothering him was the impression given by certain foreign governments that they wanted to use the election to oust him. So I think that, the two key points to take away from this is that again, not all of the fraud committed in Karzai's name was necessarily, ordered or orchestrated by him, and not all of the fraud that was committed was only on Karzai's behalf. Other candidates also received fraudulent votes. So let's look at the process and what exactly happened. As soon as reports began coming in from the polling station, we knew that there had been obviously significant amounts of fraud. There had been massive votes from stations where we had indications there was very low turnout. And then the main reason was that, or the main indicator for us was that a certain number of triggers that we had set up as fraud detection measures were being set off. And the two main ones, and I can feel Scott Warden here, cringing as we go back into words like triggers and so forth. But the two main ones were that either 95% of the votes in a single ballot box were for a single candidate, which only happens in precincts of Philadelphia and Chicago. And secondly, that all 600 votes in a single ballot box were used, which would mean that everybody that was slated to vote had voted. And what the IEC did, the Independent Election Commission, at that point, was what they were supposed to do and what we had agreed. Obviously, our fraud prevention measures hadn't worked. Fraud detection measures were working. They took the ballot boxes that exhibited these characteristics and set them aside from the count. And that was fine in the first week or 10 days as the ballots were coming in. But then the ballots from the South began to come in. And these were almost all had to be excluded. At the same time, ballots, anti-Karzai or pro-Abdullah ballots were still coming in from the North. And the IEC, again, every member of which is appointed according to the Constitution by President Karzai, began to see the percentage going down, 56, 55, 54. And the IEC then took a legally interesting decision, which was that they suddenly decided that they were not legally entitled to actually do what they'd been doing all along, which is quarantine the boxes that exhibited these characteristics. So they said, actually, we're going to count all the votes. And miraculously, Karzai got up to about 54%. The IEC sort of decided, well, we've done our job. The palace breathed a sigh of relief. And the international community then began to sort of look at themselves in panic, saying, this is exactly the election of the narrative I described at the beginning. Massive fraud, blatant IEC siding on behalf of Karzai, probably some intimidation involved, and a result that is clearly, very far from what the real result should be. And here, the second act of this drama was there's another body, the Electoral Complaints Commission, of which Scott was a member of, 3 internationals appointed by the SRSG and 2 Afghans. And they took, I think, a risky, courageous, and correct decision, which was to issue an order to the IEC to actually reinstate the triggers and either carry out a recount or an audit of all of the votes to make sure that the fraudulent ones were not included. To my surprise, the IEC, and I still don't know why, they actually accepted the order. what we feared was a situation where you have the IEC, which is an all-Afghan body whose legal essence is rooted in the Constitution, versus an Electoral Complaints Commission, which is only a product of the electoral law and that had a majority of international members. And we thought if that became a conflict, it would be very difficult to to sort of sustain the supremacy or the equalness of the ECC. But surprisingly, the IEC agreed to it, not easily, and it took weeks of negotiating with them how the audit would be conducted. But it was. Now, more words that are going to make Scott cringe, but a random sample of electoral boxes was decided on. They were picked out of a jar. They were brought from wherever they were to Kabul. And the idea was we'll do a complete recount and examination of all of these boxes, figure out the percentage of fraud, and then apply them to the universe of votes. It was very complicated. It was very controversial. It's not something that you would want to establish as a best electoral practice, but it was sort of the only option that we had. And then began several fraught weeks while this process was going on, because now we're moving towards winter. And we were afraid if there was going to be a runoff, first of all, the runoff, we thought more violence, more distrust. Nobody's looking forward to the runoff. Then our fear was we wouldn't be able to hold a runoff before the end of the year, and we'd have to wait until sort of next June, in which case we'd be facing 9 months of a power vacuum where nobody knew who the president was. So we were really hoping that Scott and his colleagues would just give us 51% and just get us out of this mess. And they failed us. And again, to go back to the narrative of Kai rigging the election on behalf of Karzai because they were good buddies, I don't think that I was with a lot of these meetings. I don't think there's ever any sense of pressure on you guys that you should be flexible on this or that to make sure there's over 50%. We just sat there and bit our fingernails and hoped the result would be over 50%, and in the end it wasn't. It was, I think, 48.6 or something, which began the next negotiation and the next crisis. Karzai obviously didn't want to accept it. He went around, he re-examined all of the methodology. That took several more weeks, and that was when, by sort of a fortuitous sense of circumstance, Senator Kerry happened to be visiting, happened to establish a good relationship, and basically somehow, and I wasn't in those meetings, so I don't know what happened, basically convinced Karzai to do what ultimately was the right thing and the only thing he could do, which was accept the fact that he had got less than 50% of the votes, accept the fact that both his IEC and the ECC, which had jointly conducted this audit, had cleaned out 1.5 million fraudulent votes, about 20% of the total, and the final result was, yeah, he had dropped 7 or 8 percentage points as a result because the vast majority of the fraud had been in his favor. And so ultimately he did accept it. Then we know how it ended. Abdullah, who was the second place candidate with whom they would have contested a runoff, said, I'll only do the runoff if there are certain reforms, and he gave a list of about 20 reforms that he wanted to see to the IEC and the electoral process in general. Karzai didn't act on that, and then Abdullah announced, for the good of the country and because I don't have any faith in these institutions, I'm not going to run. The Supreme Court, again, every member of which is appointed by the president, made a courageous and unexpected ruling that, given the circumstance, the president will be the one remaining candidate, and that was how we got basically to the inauguration. So, given all of this, and having lived through it, it was painful and nerve-wracking and uncertain, and at every moment we were fearing that we were on the brink of a crisis that would that would be very difficult to control. And our whole approach throughout was, we have to maintain the integrity of the Constitution as long as possible. There were other proposals. Let's just ditch the Constitution, have an interim government. And we had those in the back pocket, but we thought as long as we can still work through these institutions, we should work through these institutions. And that's what happened. So to hear that we tolerated fraud, I fundamentally disagree. We removed 1.5 million votes. To say that Karzai had was not affected by this, I also fundamentally disagree. It was, for him, a somewhat humiliating process. And look at elections in the region. Look at every country that borders Afghanistan and how elections are held. In China, they're basically not. In Central Asia, the leaders are elected with 90% plus votes every time until they die in office. In Iran, look what happened in the election in the same year in 2009. And in Pakistan, you have the sort of stop-go democracy with governments and coups. Nothing in Karzai's political experience or in anything he saw around the region, would have conditioned him to sort of yield easily to all of these sort of institutional impediments that had been put in front of him. And in the end, he did. So that's the basis of my appeal, basically, which is to have a little bit of patience with this early democracy, not give up on the elections that are coming up, learn ourselves from what we have done well and done badly in the past, and I think that it's not too naive to say that we could have better elections next time or even afterwards. And the example I give is of another post-conflict country where there was an extremely controversial election, disenfranchisement, intimidation of a certain set of voters in one region of the country, controversy over the fraudulent votes, how they should be counted, the establishment of an electoral commission to resolve it, the disagreement of one faction with the result of that electoral commission, and ultimately a political deal that allowed one candidate to win, who in fact was the candidate who got the least number of votes. That election was the election in 1876, and the candidates were Hayes and Tilden, and the country was this one, and the deal was worked out just down the road here. So if you have doubts about, or you want to too severely judge the Afghan election, take a look at the history of the 1876 election here and the compromise of 1877. Thanks.
I'm impressed by your historical knowledge of American elections. Thanks, Scott. Scott Warden.
One of the challenges, of course, in speaking last in a panel that is as qualified as this, as much of the good points have already been made. So much of what I'll say is actually reinforcing things that you've already heard, and I'll try to be brief. Also, special thanks to Scott for taking me down that unpleasant memory lane. My first point is similar to the ones that the other panelists have made, which is that these elections are extremely important for Afghanistan, for its future, and it's important to get them right. And I think Scott's narrative of how they can be wobbly, if not go wrong, is adds weight to that, which is to say that there have been flaws with past elections. They're well known, they're well discussed, and I think we've already heard, and I'll reinforce some of the things that can be done to make these ones better. I think, that is a key point, that, as difficult as Afghanistan's democracy has been to establish, I think what you've heard and what I've seen from my conversations with Afghans is that there's no better alternative than elections to get the political transition right. And Afghans do realize that. They are committed, and they want to find ways to overcome the challenges. So, from the U.S. side, we are strongly committed to supporting inclusive, transparent, and credible Afghan elections. These elections will be Afghan-led, appropriately so. Our role is, and the role of other international actors, is to support the Afghans to do the best job that is possible. And also to say that, as it's been agreed between our president and Karzai and in other forums, we're respectful of Afghan sovereignty. There's not going to be undue foreign interference, any foreign interference, and we're not going to support any candidate. We support the process and want to see it go well. Having said that, there is an agreement, both formally in terms of the strategic partnership agreement, as well as between the U.S. and Afghanistan, as well as in the Tokyo Agreement, which is a number of donors and allies in Afghanistan, that Afghan's democracy is important to progress, and there is a shared responsibility to support it. And I think that there are several kind of key decisions that are coming up in the next few months that will help to set a more stable foundation for credible elections, and will also help to support the political process that Nader and others described in terms of coming to an agreement and a compromise on, what is who are the appropriate candidates, number one, but also what are the kind of appropriate ways to share power in Afghanistan for the future. And so there are really four key factors that I think we're looking at and are hoping to support to set the process on a credible path. Briefly mentioned, those are having election laws that are passed by the parliament, which in particular, the importance of that is a process one, but it's also more fundamental, which is to say that the Afghan citizens, but also the body politic, the political leaders, have consensus on the rules of the game. It's important going into this process, particularly given the problems of the past, that everybody has a common understanding of who has what responsibilities and that those are apportioned fairly. So election laws passed by Parliament is the best way of getting there. And in any case, you need agreement on the rules of the road. The second point is, these elections rely particularly on having credible institutions. Scott described some of the flaws in the past that have come from institutions, and there's this issue of appointments. A credible IEC, which is the Independent Election Commission, which essentially runs all of the electoral operations, is essential, both in terms of the actual operations of the elections, but also in public perceptions. How Afghans view the commissioners themselves and the chairperson in particular really sets the tone for whether they are supportive of the decisions that the IEC makes or not. The IEC chairman, who has served in the 2010 elections, his term is ending this month. So there's a big decision that's coming up about who will be the next IEC chair. I think it's particularly important that that be a credible individual, who's respected and qualified, but also that it's chosen through a consensual process, that there are adequate consultations with a broad variety of political stakeholders so that that choice is one that can be supported nationally. A third element is relating to electoral complaints. Scott's illustrated the reason why that's so important. I'll just say, in both the 2009 elections, but as well the 2010 parliamentary elections, you can say that the key decisions on the outcome were actually made in the complaints process. It's a hugely important institution. It's a temporary institution. There is no election complaint commission established right now according to the law. So establishing a mechanism that is credible, that can act impartially and competently is very important. This relates back to the electoral law question. There are competing versions, competing laws about how the Electoral Complaints Commission can or should be structured. That will play itself out. But credible institution that is independent is a key goal and will, I think, play a significant role in the elections. And finally, in terms of what the Independent Election Commission can do itself, it is due to come out with an operational plan, which will kind of set the roadmap for how it plans to conduct elections over the next year, any day now, this week, hopefully. And I think the IEC has good technical competence at the headquarters level, and they know how to run elections, and they address large challenges. I think there are two elements in particular that an operational plan needs to address, and they've both been mentioned here. One is increasing participation. Afghanistan's population is 30 million plus, more or less. If you assume half of those population are voting age, you're looking at roughly 15 million eligible voters. And yet, in the elections since 2004, we've gone from 7 million participants to less than 4. In a population that size, you want to have a leader come out with a strong popular mandate, whatever the outcome is. And so, boosting participation nationally is going to be very important to increasing the support that Afghanistan's next government has. This, of course, faces challenges, security being the largest among them. There is still a lot of insecure areas. Voters will have trouble getting to the polls. But looking at processes that the IEC as well as the Afghan security forces can undertake to give both more physical security to voters going to the polls, but also confidence. That they understand that the security forces and others and even community leaders will support the process, will protect them when they vote. That's really important. The second element of the plan, the IEC's operational plan that's important, is to reduce fraud. Scott also laid out the significant problems we've had in the past, that Afghanistan has had in the past, over 1 million votes thrown out in the past 2 elections. That number needs to come down to relieve pressure on the IEC and the ECC to handle the process, but also as a proxy for kind of confidence in the result. even if you wind up addressing fraud, arguably you could say, well, there was lots of fraud, but it was addressed. I mean, that puts a lot of political pressure on fragile institutions, and it undermines confidence in the process. So ways that you can both increase participation but also reduce mass fraud ballot stuffing, which was the main problem in the past elections, will help to increase the confidence in the result. Let me say a few things about what USAID is doing to support the process, to reinforce these goals. Number one, we with other donors contribute to the UNDP. It's a basket fund. It's a project called ELECT, which is basically the way that the international community supports the IEC to conduct its electoral operations. And so, donors are, I think maybe against what was said earlier, donors are fully willing to support and fund the process based on the IEC's plans and requests. So we are giving that support together with other donors through ELECT. I think that there are some important things to recognize about the preparation so far. On the one hand, a year is a short amount of time. On the other hand, I think the IEC and also even the security forces have been further ahead on their planning than they have at similar points in past elections. And I think that's a reflection of the capacity that the IEC in particular has built up in order to understand problems and plan to address them. So that's a main part of USAID's assistance, is the actual election operations through the Afghan institutions. The other significant area of support will be through civil society, or to support civil society capacity building, also to support political parties, coalitions to understand the process, for example, to have greater capacity to engage in the technical legal reforms that Nader mentioned earlier, doing ways to facilitate conversations between Afghans, among Afghans, so that the people can clearly state their demands and work through the representative institutions. And there's a robust program to support civil society in doing that already and then going forward. A special category which involves civil society but is somewhat apart from it is public outreach. Both the IEC and media institutions on their own will play a significant role in communicating messages of encouragement to increase participation, but also messages about that will increase people's understanding of the electoral process and how they can participate in it. So public outreach is key. And again, I think what the IEC and others are looking to do is to have a narrative for success, to show Afghans, to tell Afghans what is different from past elections. Do we acknowledge the flaws that have been mentioned here? And do we have a positive plan to address them? And I think as the IEC operational plan comes out, there will be messages to tell about how these elections will be better than before. Finally, and particularly relevant to Nader, support for domestic observation. FIFA is the leading domestic observation consortium. There are other groups as well that observe elections, and candidates themselves have candidate agents who will go and represent political interests at the polls to make sure there's not fraud, there aren't irregularities. I think this is intrinsically related to security. It's difficult to get out to polling stations in some areas of the country. But a more transparent election is a more fair election. And so getting more eyes on the process, even in remote and somewhat insecure areas, is a high priority, I think, to overall deter fraud, to reduce the number of ballots, the amount of ballot stuffing, and ways that the IEC, the security forces, and civil society can work together to make sure that more people see more of the polls will be critical to the election's fairness and success. Let me conclude with a few kind of thematic points. Oh, finally, sorry, I forgot. The other area that we're supporting or focusing on is women, getting women's greater participation. But it's participation in a few different categories. Women need to participate as candidates. There are, particularly in the provincial council, there's a minimum quota for female seats. I believe it's 25%. In the last elections for parliament, there were one, if not two women above that quota that were elected. Several women won the most votes in their province in the parliamentary race. So there are promising signs that women are being recognized as candidates, but they face enormous challenges, security, culture among them. So figuring out ways that more women can run and more women can effectively campaign is a key focus. But it's not just as candidates, it's also as election workers. One key that I think we've found from past elections is that women's participation depends in part on are there women involved in the administration of the elections. It goes, that includes female searchers in women's-only polling stations to make the situation more secure, but it also includes female public outreach officials. You know, our messages being conveyed in a way that women can hear despite cultural constraints in Afghanistan. And then finally, women as voters. The numbers have been about 40% female participation, but depending on the province, some of those, are, as was mentioned, you know, are proxy votes, and I think that percentage is probably an exaggeration of reality. Getting the real percentage of women that are voters up will significantly improve the process and obviously make the result more representative. So those are the things that USAID is particularly focused on and working through our Afghan partners and institutions to do. And then finally, you know, some closing points. One thing is, you know, we've heard in this discussion that there are both process benchmarks, and then there's also, you know, political and outcome benchmarks. You know, I really see the two as interrelated. I think that, you know, this is a momentous, my view is that this is a momentous political transition in Afghanistan's history. I mean, it's the first time that they will have democratically changed top leadership. That produces a lot of nervousness, anxiety about the future, understandably. The more confidence I believe that people have in the fundamental fairness of the process, that the institutions are credible, that the rules are agreed, that the plans are in place, the more the environment is conducive to compromise. There's more trust in the process. If there's more trust in the process, then you might be more willing to make political compromises to have a smooth transition. So I think that the process is not necessarily sufficient to ensure a good election, but it is essential as a foundation for the kind of agreements that need to be made and the compromises that need to be made to avoid past problems. Let me end with that and happy to answer any other questions.
Thank you very much for four very good presentations, but also four very timely presentations, which is often not the norm at some of our panels. So thank you very much, which leaves us a lot of time for question, answer, and discussion. I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative to start off by make a comment, but asking a question of Nader and Hosai, and then open it up to questions from the floor. Again, when I was in Kabul last month, again, I was struck, again, with quite a bit of the skepticism that, one, the government was committed, but also is the U.S. and the international community committed, and to actually holding the election. How high on the U.S. government's priority list are elections? You know, is the bilateral security agreement more important than elections, or what? Again, the troop number debate has dominated a lot of the press here. So in that regard, several people commented very favorably about Secretary Kerry's confirmation hearings, where for one of the first very public remarks by a U.S. government official of the importance of the elections. I'd just like to actually read those here because I think they are very important in that regard. He said that having an election that passes muster and is acceptable according to international observers and the standards will be critical to our ability to have the kind of transition we want to have and to have confidence that the government that succeeds in 2014 has legitimacy. If it doesn't have legitimacy, if we don't succeed in that effort, it's going to be very, very difficult to convince the American people and convince our allies in ISAF and beyond to stay engaged in this effort. So, which I think, again, as I said, several political leaders in Afghanistan commented on that it was very helpful to hear that message, and I'm hopeful that that is a signal of where we're heading, where we're going to have more public messaging about the importance of the elections, both for Afghans, but also for U.S. national interests that are the political. We don't see that these other transitions can go smoothly. However, there has also been this reluctance, and in part due to, in a way, the legacy of the 2009 election. And Scott spoke to some aspects of that, but one of the other aspects was also the perception that in that election, the U.S. actually got involved in actually picking favorites and went into trying to influence more specifically the outcome and rather than the process as Scott was talking about. But I think it's really important that the lesson from that experience is, and I think it has been learned, is that we shouldn't be involved in the business of trying to pick the favorite candidate we want to elect. But it shouldn't be, again, that we should be, remain uninvolved or so quiet about the elections that Afghans perceive that we're staying uninvolved. Because if we bend over too backwards in terms of trying to be quiet and, and trying to be impartial in our perspectives, from many Afghans I've talked to, that's not the perspective there, is that our silence is viewed as not being impartial, but actually backing the incumbent at the expense of others. And so how do we recognize that elections are not a technical event, they're a political event, and the technical process part of it are really important, as Scott highlighted, to also having a successful political outcome, but not going so far to being accused of what we did in 2009. And so I think that's what I'm kind of wondering from Nader and Hosai's perspective. What do you think the U.S. in particular and the international community in general should be doing to communicate more effectively the importance of these elections without crossing the line into being perceived to inappropriately interfere in the internal affairs? But again, the perspective that you often hear is that the U.S. is sometimes perceived to be respecting one individual sovereignty at the expense of the nation's sovereignty. So I guess, how do we get that balance right?
Thank you, Scott. Before coming to responding to that question, briefly coming to an issue of the expectation of Afghans on terms of technicality, what kind of elections they want. The assumption mostly is, well, you don't need to push the high standards in there. While the narrative that people see and the way that they want to see the election be is much more different. They do want to see high standards respected. The experiences and the lessons we learned from 2009 shall not discourage us to push for further high standards rather than uphold. And I just gave you an example. Copies of these are available down there. I study kind of a survey, a very brief, simple survey we conducted as a Free and Fair Election Foundation with the members of the parliament. From 121 members of parliament, we asked on different aspects of the electoral law that they are, the bill that they are discussing now in the parliament and different committees, which in a couple of weeks they're going to start voting on that and discussing and voting on that in the plenary. When you go to each part of that, from promotion of more representation, a representative parliament, where rights of minorities like Hindus and more positive or affirmative action or provisions where minorities to get more in the parliament, including the Hindu minorities, to the much more capable and legally enabled fraud mitigation and fraud prevention and complaint adjudication mechanisms like the ECC. You see across the board a major support there. Just a few examples here. From 121 MPs who talked to FIFA, 94 of them highly supported a very strong permanent institution of Electoral Complaint Commission. They also supported, in major part, that a proper mechanism of vetting to be in place, where bad guys need not to come in the parliament, where some of those MPs feel that it was not respected properly. Now, 97% of them supported strongly for a proper vetting mechanism. And there are other figures and narrative here. I would encourage you to go to that report. But coming to your question, Andrew, in terms of the U.S. staying neutral or not out there. Look at the reaction that President Karzai received in his last comments about the U.S.-Taliban collusion. And the reaction he received both in the parliament and across the country was so overwhelming and significant. Afghans, not from Kabul or from urban cities or people like me speaking English, but those from Khost, from Paktia and Kandahar, stood up in the floors of parliament, said, President Karzai, you do not speak for us about the relation of Afghanistan with the United States. Deputy Speaker of Parliament spoke clearly and loudly, who is a delegate from the east of the country, said, Afghan do need a stronger partnership with the international community, and we do value a partnership with the United States. But at the same time, while there's so much value that Afghans attach to this partnership, there's the other side of it also. If you do things, you're going to be blamed for it. And if you don't do things, you're going to be blamed for it also. Things that happened in 2009 and later on, they were things that went wrong. And there were failures in properly assessing the course of action. You got blamed for it. In the times that you did not do, you did not fail to do the right things in 2009, in 2004, in 2005, you also got blamed for it. Staying neutral in a situation where you do not have a normal diplomatic relation or a normal diplomatic posting in there. You've spent billions of dollars there. The rest of the international community did so the same. You have troops there, more than 100,000 troops were there, and still there's a large number of troops on ground. And they're going to be for at least a significant number up to 2014. Afghans do recognize that fact, and they do see it as a positive deterrent to forces that are trying to create instability, trying to push back the country to the past, a past that they do not wish to go back to it. Afghans across the country, from on my visits to the remote provinces like Uruzgan, to the very vibrant cities like in Herat or in Jalalabad, they do have a different perspective. They have different tendencies that are very significantly different from what it was 10 years ago. And part of that tendency is a stable, democratic Afghanistan that has a stronger partnership with the United States. Now, with that, they do not expect their partners to just stay neutral. The first thing they expect is it's a political process and it's a technical process. On technical side, you cannot come and say, well, because it's Afghanistan, you keep very low the bar. A credible, something acceptable to Afghans, it's okay to us. They expect you, as the United States, to come and take the high moral ground as member of international community that you want anywhere else to uphold the high standards pre-elections. I'm not just an idealist to say throughout you keep saying that. Pre-election, we do need to promote these high standards. Once the election conducted, there will be problems, and then you need to switch to pragmatist mood, not before that. Actually, when Secretary Kerry in his last visit, not only in his hearing, but in his last visit, for the first time we saw a change in the messaging. And it was positive, and it was so much welcomed by a lot of Afghans, political parties, civil society, and others. Not only talking about the need for the election to happen, but keep emphasizing on free and fair election, on not only on an acceptable election, but on an election that is internationally approvable. Those messages matter so much. It sends signal. It prevents people to prepare for a wholesale fraudulent election. And therefore, you do need, on technical side, to raise these issues time and again. On the political side, in the past 10 years, there is a growing number of Afghan political activists, some emerging new political groups who have invested so much and fought for a democratic, open political space and a democratic and stable Afghanistan. And there's also, we shall not forget, that there are forces who are so much invested to bring back Afghanistan to the era of repression, religious conservatism, and do everything to restrict rights and freedoms that Afghans have gained in the last 10 years. They're much more visible. They're smaller, but much more visible. They do have resources. And they are the dominant voices also, because the palace is giving them a space. They already have those structures from the past. But you look at the democratic voices there, you look at the democratic forces there, they're on daily basis struggling to open spaces, to push the boundaries, despite all the challenges that are there. If you stay neutral and do not show that you are on the side of those democratic voices, you actually facilitate their failure, and therefore you shall not stay neutral in that front. Thank you.
Well, I don't think so. I'll be able to articulate it as nicely as Nader did. But just to add on, it's the same issue of whether you're involved, then the government will come up if things turn out to be bad on their part to blame you. And if not, then the civil society will come after you and to say that, you have to raise your voice. Because, as a normal citizen of that country, if we are going to encounter a problem, obviously being the government on power actually and committing those frauds, who else we have to go to? And I think, this issue of staying neutral, I think, would no longer apply as soon as we actually, the government of Afghanistan signed a strategic agreement with the United States. And I think that was mainly to help the Afghan community and the Afghans to ensure a fair and transparent, beside all the other issues, an election process. And I think, staying neutral into something that you have already committed would not be, it's a little bit too late, and I think, that would not be possible at this stage of time. But one thing that actually I would like to say is that, how much we can proceed in terms of, setting a set of indicators to say what exactly our involvement means here. And I think that would, a little bit, in a way, reduce the blame game as such. Okay, when we are saying we are supporting the Afghan elections, and I think, making it a little bit more clear, saying, okay, is it that we are there to financially support? Is it there that we are actually working in terms of, encouraging Afghans to come and step forward? Making those things very clear would, in a way, would also be able actually to mitigate this problem to a certain level that's there. And I think, giving as a supporter in terms of, financial support and all that, I do not want to say that one should not be involved because, they are financially paying, or they should be involved because they are financially paying. But I think, the U.S. government is also accountable for each and every penny that they are paying back to their own people in terms of, if you have an election full of fraud, what are going to be the justification of the U.S. government to its own people that why did they provided and supported a process which is actually full of fraud? And if you do not want to actually be involved and stay neutral, is it that why when we provided, free lunches to something that we were not even able to say that, okay, they have to, be clear on certain criteria for transparency and accountability. So I think, in a way, staying neutral will harm Afghans more, in my very personal, opinion, than actually be involved to a certain level to ensure that we are having a very smooth and clear and a transparent process.
Another wanted one last comment, and then I promise we'll get to all of you for questions and discussion.
Recently, I've been in the Middle East, mostly in the North Africa, and there I do see this issue of being neutral or being not neutral in support of the democratic voices. For Afghanistan, you cannot wait for an Arab Spring few years down the road and say, okay, now we're going to help that democratic voices there. What happened in the North Africa, Middle East, especially in Libya, in Tunisia, in Egypt, are very clear lessons for those who want to see democracy succeed and for those who want to see the voices and the forces who want to get the nations towards stability and progress, how they fail or succeed. There, currently, the forces that are dominant, that are taking the lead, that are taking in the parliament, are those forces that are restricting freedoms, that are restricting democratic voices. And in Afghanistan today, you have already a majority of Afghan population who do support a path that is democratic and they want to succeed in that path. And just setting aside and saying, okay, let them do whatever they want to do. Yes, this is our fight. We have to fight it and continue fighting it. But if you stay aside, the challenges will be enormous and significantly more than what we have today. And therefore, for the future of Afghan Spring or whatever, or a democratic forces to succeed, to establish what they want to establish, is going to be much more difficult for you and for the rest of our partners internationally. And therefore, we shall not wait to see that first the forces come and then to join them, because then it will be difficult like it is today in Libya. You do not see that the democratic voices who struggle to get into the parliament majority, because of their inability of both in terms of political organization and the support that they didn't had it before, for them to keep that democratic space that they want to have it for them in that parliament and that institution. The forces who are for conservatism, who are for radicalism, and who are for militancy are much more increasingly dominantly and stronger voices there. We shall not allow that to return in Afghanistan.
Thank you. Okay, floor is open. I think we'll take 3 or 4 questions at a time and then come back to the panel. Do we have a microphone? Over there.
Hello.
Also, identify yourself first.
My name is Dennis Barrow. I'm from the German embassy, from the political department. First of all, I want to thank you. I think it was very informative. I have 2 questions. You said there will be technical and political delays already. How great will be the possibility that there will be actually elections in 1 year, so on the 5th of April next year? And my second question is in how far the Taliban are involved, not in the presidential elections, but in the provinces as a political party or political arms of the Taliban. How far will be they involved, and could they be successful?
We'll take, as I said, 2 or 3 questions now. Any more? Or if not, okay.
Hi, my name is Rufus Phillips. Hello, Nader. How are you? Nice to see you again. What I wanted to do was to offer some ideas, so I don't want to blend that with questions because I really do have some ideas about what we could do out there.
Can you turn that? Is that on?
No, maybe it's not on.
It is on, okay.
Yeah. Okay. So I'd rather reserve a time to offer some specific ideas rather than just a question.
Okay.
Because I was out there.
Question here.
Hello, my name is Lauren. Thank you to all of you for your very interesting commentary. Almost all of you spoke about the importance of the electoral reform and IEC structure legislation pending before the National Assembly and the importance of upholding high standards. And my question to you, in the event the National Assembly fails to promulgate these laws, should or will the international community withhold funding?
Thank you. Ajmal Ghani from the Afghanistan Council. Great insight from both Ms. Wardak and Mr. Nadiri into the mechanism that is needed for a prerequisite for the election. And I think most Afghans will agree with you. Please don't lower the bar, just because this is Afghanistan. If we do that, then we will lose everything that we've done in the past 12 years. But judging from the past 12 years of political events in Afghanistan, elections will happen, one way or another, because we've seen that. History has shown. And learning from past flawed election of, I was going to say 2000 Florida, but I'll stick to 2009 Afghanistan. Whomever wins will rule, just like Karzai did in the past 4 years. So that's why the importance of this election is crucial to the Afghans. The one issue is the expectations and the playing fields are not leveled, as you know. The money. Some of the people that are mentioned in the op-eds have gotten so much money, and it's ill-gotten money. Somebody who goes from a translator at UNDP to the most powerful person in Iraq with a couple of $100 million, while the other so-called more acceptable candidates have no money. How do you address that, and whom do you see with the right team?
We'll take one more question and come back to the panel.
Nurgali Arstanov from the Embassy of Kazakhstan. What are the names possible names for the candidates at this point of time? It has been announced that the candidates are not yet announced, but what are your expectations? Who might come forward? And just wanted to know. Thanks.
Okay, why don't we come back to the panel? We'll start with you, Scott.
Thanks for the questions. I'll take a few of them that I think are relevant for my role. One thing on the date, I certainly am confident that the elections will happen on the assigned date. The point that I wanted to make from that question is, I think that is actually an under-recognized significant achievement, which is to say there was a lot of uncertainty 6 months ago or more about would there be elections, will we have them on time according to the Constitution, which calls for spring elections, rather than a delay to the fall, which has happened in the past. And I think the early setting of the election date both demonstrates what's been said before about the resolve of Afghanistan to have elections, that is the only and best option to manage this political transition. But the idea that they did agree on that date and that it is on track, I think is important for the process. In terms of the election laws being passed and funding, I mean, there's no tie between the two. There's no quid pro quo. The support that I described, both the U.S. but also international partners organized through the UN is giving, is for a good process. It's for the institutions of Afghanistan to manage it. What I listed were what I think are some key indicators, some reforms that would be necessary to have the best possible elections. But overall, I mean, we're looking at this holistically, and the idea is not to undermine in any way the administration of the election if one part doesn't go well. It's rather to support the process holistically, and I think that the donors together are committed to doing that. And then just a short note, I mean, in terms of the uneven playing field and specifically with campaign finance, just to point out, I mean, neither the U.S. nor I think any other international party is supporting financially any candidates or any campaigns. I mean, that's obviously not our role. I do know, however, that campaign finance reform, if I can call it that for Afghanistan, but there are regulations, the IEC, reporting regulations the IEC had in place in 2009. I know the proposals are on the table to enhance that, and I think that's going to be a slow and steady process, but I know that the IEC is looking at that to try to control at least reporting where money is coming from, but ultimately to work for a more level playing field, and I think that is an important long-term reform to have.
Thanks. Let me say a few words first about the date of the election. As Scott just pointed out, it was for the first time a date has been set which is within the constitutional limit, but may or may not be within the practical geographical limit of carrying out massive logistical operations in Afghanistan. And there's been a reason why there hasn't been an election held earlier than August, which has mostly to do with weather. My analysis is that there was because you have to ask yourself, why does the Constitution have elections, scheduled for April in a country like Afghanistan, where it's extremely difficult to do them in April? And the only analysis I can come up with is one of the international advisors to the Constitutional Commission was French. And in France, they have elections in April and May, and I don't think anybody really looked at this, and we're sort of stuck with it. So let's hope they will not be delayed, because if they are delayed, it will generate a crisis similar to the one that we had at the beginning of 2009 when the same thing happened. Actually, the parties had agreed on an August date, but early in 2009, some members of Karzai's opponents sprung a little idea, which was, fine, we agreed to have the elections in August, but according to the Constitution, your term ends in May, so there should be an interim government and and sort of a caretaker administration that runs the elections, and that created a huge controversy. And if the elections had to be delayed, you might end up with that sort of thing happening again. On the question of funding, I think that on the one hand, the funding is our leverage. On the other hand, it's not leverage at all, because who benefits from not being able to finance an election? So I think that we don't have an option. I agree with Scott. This is part of a larger process, and we can't sort of play a game sort of financial blackmail over the elections, on which many people, as Nader and Hosai were saying, do hold are putting their hopes in. There is one little technical issue there, which I think is going to be a lot more difficult to resolve than we may realize right now, and that is that, as often in Afghanistan, we're sometimes the victims of our own propaganda, or not propaganda, but our own policy choices. Let me correct that. Policy choices. Yeah, policy choices. I misspoke. And one of our recent policy choices has been, we say, look, more spending needs to go through the Afghan government, as opposed to spending on projects outside of the budget. The Afghan, they need to be able to take responsibility, but to take responsibility, they have to have, the resources. So, we've been saying 50%, I think, of funding should go through the Afghan government. And the Afghan government very cleverly said, yes, but let's do better than that on elections. Let's have 100% of the elections financed through the Ministry of Finance. And in most countries, there are clear firewalls for electoral budgets, for electoral commissions and electoral processes, where Parliament can approve it. In some countries, Parliament can approve it, but not change it, not make amendments. So, on the one hand, this is a nice appeal for sovereignty and good governance. On the other hand, it's fraught with the potential of having a minister of finance of a sitting government that may or may not have a preference in the next election, controlling spending of the so-called independent electoral commission. You can't have an independent electoral commission that is not financially independent, and that's something that Scott Warden and others will have to deal with at some point in the near future. But it's a little bomb waiting to explode, I think. And the campaign finance issue. I don't know any country which has resolved it very well, and certainly it's difficult in Afghanistan to sort of see who's spending what on what. The only thing I would say is that there have been examples in the past in other countries where an opposition has run an election campaign sort of uphill on the playing field, so to speak, and has prevailed. And I think that certainly I think that there. An opposition for the 2014 election would have decent reasons to think that they would have a lot of people on their side, and they may even need to be prepared to fight a campaign that looks like is rigged against them by the powers of the state.
Could I just say, I think we've talked. The issue of the date has been addressed, and the issue of
we left the Taliban.
Yeah, but we'll leave the Taliban to you two in terms of their policy on the elections. And the issue of speculating on candidacies is a fraught one in Afghanistan. But if you're brave enough, you can feel free to do it. But technically, until September, when the filing period happens, we don't know. So at this point, we don't have any formal candidates. But those are two of the remaining questions.
Well, I'm heading an independent, impartial electoral monitoring body, so I'm not going to name anybody in terms of who's going to be a team or going to be the candidate. But there is a very lively discussion and debate and bargaining among different groups, which will emerge, as you said. The electoral law suggests, and the electoral calendar suggests, that on November 1st, the candidate nomination will begin. So by then we will have clear names. On the Taliban, President Karzai just this week called on Taliban leader Mullah Omar to come and run for the presidential elections. Their response was this 9 suicide attacker entering to number of civilian institutions in one of the provinces and killing more than 40 civilians and injuring more than 100 of them. So it's a good indication that they are going to participate in the elections. Some of those Talibans who have left their groups, they are kind of joining the process, or they joined the political process in the past 11 years. Some of them did run actually for the elections. But most of them, or all of them, miserably failed. They did not get vote. From Mullah Wakil Ahmad Mutawakkil, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Taliban, who was probably one of the very relatively, comparatively to the rest of the Taliban, was much more wiser voice in them. He ran for the parliamentarian election. He didn't make it. Mullah Karzai was another one, the Taliban's former Minister of Interior, ran for the election. He did not receive any vote. And so other members of the Taliban who actually left the Taliban, stayed in Kabul or other provinces, and tried to be part of the political process. And that is an indicator how much they may enjoy public support. There's no legal obstacle for a Talib to run for the election, as long as they announce the violence, put the gun down, and join the political process. But we don't see yet any indication that the Mullah Omar will announce his candidacy. That was it.
Just to very briefly add, the likelihood that Taliban will participate, especially those who have not reintegrated in the government structure itself, is very low, in a sense that their prerequisite in order to be able to start negotiation with the government and to be involved in the process is changing constitution. And if that would not happen, their likelihood to come and participate in the election would be very low. On the second part of actually with the U.S. Will continue support, I would like to say that, when I mentioned the fact that we have to have a criteria and indicators in terms of what our involvements are, is particularly focusing on issues as such. We have actually, the president come and said we can use the same old, voter registration card. Will the involvement still be there? If we will actually be able not to get the election, bill approved by the parliament as such, with, having the president having the capacity and the power to go and assign the commissioners and as well as the head of the election commission by himself, will the assistance still proceed or not? These are all the very tiny steps that are actually going to, at the end of the day, question the whole issue of transparency of the elections. So therefore, when I said that, we have to set the indicator, especially for the U.S. government, to say that what are the indicators in terms of being involvement in the elections, we're basically tackling all these small issues here.
Let's go back to questions.
Thank you to USIP. Hamid Karzai from the National Endowment for Democracy. Thank you for hosting this timely panel. This question is for Hossein Wardak and Nader Nadri. You both alluded regarding the role of the youth that they could play in the upcoming election. As you mentioned, they constitute 2/3 of the Afghan population. So in your view, what needs to be done to mobilize, integrate, and engage them in the upcoming political transition or election? Thank you.
Yalda Kazemi with the State Department. I wanted to first make a comment in that I couldn't agree more with Scott that the narrative is increasingly important as we get closer to the election date, a positive narrative. I feel like often the narrative is dominated by doubt and skepticism, but some of the indicators of, healthy indicators of a democratic process that Nader pointed out about discussions politically inside of Afghanistan about a variety of issues, that is unprecedented, and we don't hear a lot about that. So I think besides the IEC having a responsibility to change that narrative, there's a collective responsibility with the media and political organizations and civil society inside and outside of Afghanistan to focus on some of these changes here that you noted that we haven't seen in Afghan society before. The link to the narrative comment, I can't remember who mentioned it, but the IEC commissioner's term is expiring very soon, and if the IEC structural law does not get passed, and I won't ask you if you expect it to get passed, but you're welcome to comment. If it does not get passed in time, is there a public demand or discussions within Afghan society asking the palace to pursue a consultative and transparent process in appointing a commissioner? I have seen in the past when civil society and the public mobilizes and demands of the palace to take some sort of action, sometimes there is a constructive response and maybe sometimes there isn't. But anyhow, and then a second question related to that, this was something Scott mentioned about at a provincial level, the IEC officials at a local level have been involved in the fraud. And so for 2014, I mean, the institutions have remained the same. So in 2014, what preparations, what systems of accountability and oversight can be put into place to govern what those individuals do and to detect any sort of fraud that they partake in, and then to hold them accountable, because that's the issue, that there's no accountability.
Hi, I'd like to ask one on behalf of Staff Sergeant Eugene Tong, who's joining us via webcast in Afghanistan. Scott, you mentioned the importance of security on Election Day. What steps are being taken now to ensure minimal electoral violence, and who is in charge of managing that security?
Just to put a finer point on one of Yelda's questions, and this would be for Nader and Hassai, with respect to the electoral laws, I mean, is there a recognition that you see that that timing is also important, and does civil society and do the parliamentarians themselves understand that you know, being for passage of these laws is one thing, but that if you pass the IEC structure law 2 months from now, you've kind of missed the boat. Thanks.
The youth mobilization. The good news is that the majority of the youth are already very much mobilized and engaged into both the political development and election discussion. I do see much more encouraging signs of the youth groups in different provinces, even at remote provinces as Roer province, which most of the time accessibility through road is so much difficult there. I see youth groups involved not only in their own local issues in terms of advocating and raising issues, but much more politically active on the bigger picture of the national political agendas, and especially on elections. I do see articles that have been written in the local newspapers that are being sent from different provinces that are written by the youth groups or youth activists. While there is a good sense of involvement and political engagement, something that is lacking and need to happen much more is that they are not yet structured political views in support of certain agendas for today or the future. That will only happen if you have candidates who can articulate that kind of a vision, but at the same time present a way forward where it can mobilize a much more larger number of the youth groups there. A major part of this round of elections vote will be dependent, or success of any candidate will be dependent on the vote of the youth, because they will be able, and they showed in the past also, to risk and to go to the polling stations. Now, whoever is capable of mobilizing that vote is going to get a much more chance for winning the election. That's one part from us, from the Afghans themselves, from the political opposition, from civil society and others. We, as Free and Fair Election Foundation, we're going to deploy 10,000 electoral observers, and almost 80% of those observers are going to be made of the youth crowd. On the international side, there are probably other experiences, situations like us, where there's insecurity, there's instability, there's not probably encouraging candidates to mobilize people. There's also other group of youth, the other side of the border, they're trained in the madrasas, and they try to also be very active in promoting violence. How those other experiences in similar scenarios, or probably semi-similar scenarios, to be brought in through institutions like NDI, RI, IFS, or others, and to engage these youth groups to how they can get involved in get people out for voting on civic education and others, or support their ideas of civic education in that sense. On the public demand from the palace, you already see a very much articulated demand around the electoral issues. When media debates are formulated, individuals who are not electoral experts, but sitting on roundtables talking about Article 93 of the bill submitted to the Parliament, gives more authority to the president to cancel the election, and this is wrong. And then alternative views are being presented. So you already see that there is a good level of public engagement and voice out there, mostly through media, but also through different forums like civil society organizations. And expectation from those voices to, in the event where the electoral law not to be passed in timely manner, and the president to go ahead with using his old practices to a point, you will certainly see a huger reaction, a much more louder outcry. Mostly, I would say, will be mobilized by the political parties. This coalition there's called Coordination of Political Parties, which are composed of parties who are part of the Afghan government, like Hizb Islami, Afghan Millat, and others, or Mahaz, and there are majority of those who are not part of the government. They all share and push for an agenda. And you will see that voice out there. There are working groups through a process that, again, we as FIFA facilitated in adoption of the Declaration of the Electoral Reform, the Declaration of Principles of Electoral Reform. 40 political parties, 16 civil society organizations are engaged on weekly basis that they are bringing issues up, and I expect that they will be outspoken. Now, how much the palace will be responsive to those outcries is something else. In the event where the Afghan voices are out there and our international partners, not much publicly, but on the closed door, are firm on their position, pressing for that, it's going to work. I was very delighted to hear from Secretary Kerry in his last visit, in the meeting that happened. He confirmed that he raised this directly to the president, and said an independent IEC is a key to the future of the democratic process here, and they will very much like to see that. Standing on that position and not taking a step back, as it happened in the past, when there was a position was taken by international community, President Karzai pushed back and kept pushing, and after a while, our international partners have backed back and gave him the way to do the way he wants. We want at this stage, we as Afghans, we're going to push it, and we will stand, we will not back. It's equally critical and important for our international partners to stay on the position and not back. I see local level officials. It is a major issue as part of the reform. We're currently pressing the Independent Election Commission to announce and release the name of those. As they say, there's around 9,000, more than 9,000 officials of the polls who facilitated fraud, to release the names of them. And for us, not only to serve this release of name as a name and shame as a preventive mechanism, but also for us to go and check if that's really the case. Those individuals who are blacklisted, their names are being announced, if they are part of the same institution or not. And that will in itself serve in improving the level of accountability of those local officials. Electoral violence. The experience of 2004-2005 showed that if Pakistan cooperate and behave well, there will be lesser level of violence during the election. And they behaved well only and at the time if the United States and other international partners have delivered very clear and strong messages to Islamabad. That happened in 2004, that happened in 2005. Messages were delivered to Islamabad that they will not tolerate, or whatever way that they've presented, but in one occasion they said they will not tolerate a higher degree of violence through cross-bordering of the Taliban during the elections. It did work. a significant level of reduced in the violence. The Afghan National Security Forces are already discussing some, but they are very far from developing a very coherent plan for electoral violence, preventing electoral violence. We need more of preparation at their side. We do see voices of doubt and concern in the military personnel of Afghan National Security Forces, basically because of their inability in their logistical side. They do say they don't have a capability of rapid response in case there's an issue, an attack on an electoral cycle, because they don't have the same logistical backbone as the NATO forces have had. And therefore, they still think that for this time, there be more of support, probably for the last time, a preparation from our NATO allies for the election. I would start.
Very briefly, in terms of the timing for the bill, sticking with the parliament, there is already a discussion among the civil society that they would soon be sending an open letter to the Afghan parliament for saying that they have to start working on the election bill itself, because it has been now pending with them. And I think the likelihood that they would not approve it is little, because the extensive work that has been done. And I think if that would not be approved, it will be, as Nader said, the reaction is going to be very strong. Into that sense. But coming back actually to the issue of youth, I think, with youth, very encouraging that we have actually getting some of the major groups emerging and playing a very neutral role. We have been hearing the names like Afghan 1400 or A3 and other groups, that they are actually, comprised of those young generation working at the different ministerial level in government positions, but those who have been involved in a civil society one way or the other. That's very encouraging, I think, giving the youth, coming from provinces. But the only worry that I have here is that, normally voting in Afghanistan has always been perceived that you have to vote for a candidate because he or, comes from a certain ethnic group as such. And I have to vote for this person because I want to have, this ethnic group to have more votes, at the end of the day. But in terms of, why they have to vote and connecting that to the daily services they are receiving, that's something which is really missing. And I think, working with the current, group which are, working very actively, and I believe that they are playing a very vital role, not only, as a voter, but in terms of, passing on the message to the rest of youth at the community level, monitoring the process, and eventually actually coming up with a young political leader. To run for any post, be it, parliament or provincial councils. That's important. But the only worry for me is that, in the long run, we have to work to connect vote in terms of what they are going to receive at the end of the day in terms of services, not because we want to actually vote for a certain candidate because he comes from a certain tribe.
Thank you.
Yeah, a quick point to pick up on Yeldo's point about the narrative. One of the things that allowed such massive fraud in 2009 was the existence of these so-called ghost stations, which were polling stations opened in very insecure parts of the country, where in fact there were no voters, no observers. They went straight to the house of a police chief who, stuffed them and then sent them back. And then I described a little bit about how the IEC had its, its own conflicts with the rule of law. So in 2010, the number of these, and in 2009 we decided basically to risk risk opening more of these ghost stations to not disenfranchise voters in those areas, in part also because of the ethnic dimension. 2010, the number of ghost stations was cut drastically. Another story which has been missed is that the IEC of that election really held firm. It didn't bow to political pressure from the palace, and so I was very surprised to read in the New York Times after 2010, an article criticizing the electoral process for disenfranchising voters in the South and being too rigid, on the application of the electoral law, whereas the line in 2009 had been allowing too many ghost stations and not following the law. So when it comes to training of journalists, I've always been in favor of a program that trains international journalists as well as local journalists. But also, I mean, just as an American, when you travel the world, it's in terms of the narrative and the narrative that we want to establish, it always amazes me that we can get entire societies up in arms over the relative merits of Coke and Pepsi, which are two carbonated drinks indistinguishable from each other. But when it comes time to try to set a political line, we can't seem to get people to, believe what we think they should believe.
You always leave a tough act for me to follow. Let me pick up on a couple of these points briefly. In terms of youth engagement, not much to add except, from I not only was there in 2009, but I was an observer of the 2010 process. And it occurred to me at that time, what a contrast the voting patterns are from this country, where, in the U.S., it's the older voters that get out and the youth are vastly underrepresent themselves. In Afghanistan, it's the reverse. I mean, youth are the ones that are running the polls that I saw, particularly in urban areas, of course, but they're the ones that go to the polls. Not only so they have a lot of potential influence on the process, even in a culture that I would say is not youth oriented as far as political power. So one idea that I've had just observing Afghan voting over time is youth need to figure out how to identify and then dare I say lobby on based on their power at the polls. So can youth deliver, hopefully on issue basis, but can youth deliver votes that represent their numbers, and then what does that actually have in terms of political power? How does that translate to political power? I think there's a huge potential that can be organized and articulated there, and something that these emerging youth groups might look at. In terms of IEC local level involvement in fraud, I am encouraged by as Nader said, the IEC has identified, they say, thousands of workers. I think that, and I know that they're focused on examining their hiring practices. And I think that as a general procedural matter, that needs to be more transparent. And I think it's also an opportunity for observer groups, but as well as political groups, to engage early in the process. It's not just looking and making sure that people that were involved in past fraud, if it can be proved, or punished. But looking forward, it's, who are the community members that are trusted, and how do they wind up getting hired by the IEC? Is the IEC hiring the right people? Are they credible? Because I think that has a lot of impact in the local community. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but that will set the tone locally for whether the process is seen as credible or not. So the hiring practices and what the IEC does over time is something that I think observer groups and political entities can really get engaged in at the local level. In terms of security, it's an ANSF, Afghan National Security Forces lead. My understanding, and I'm not into the details on this, but ISAF is supporting them, but it is a supporting role. One thing that I would highlight, and it relates to the ghost polling stations that Scott mentioned, one very positive, but kind of under the radar development recently is that the IEC submitted their list of proposed polling stations, polling locations, to the Afghan security forces for them to then evaluate which are secure and which are not. And this is critical, not only to eliminating ghost polling stations, but to making sure that the participation gains that I mentioned earlier can be realized. Are people near enough to polling stations that, given the prevailing security as well as weather conditions, they can actually get out and vote? That being done now, a year before the process, is a huge advance on what's happened in previous years, where I think the final decision on polling station was made weeks, if not days, in advance. So that's a big positive potential step. What needs to happen now is, one, for the Afghan security forces to come back in a reasonable amount of time, but also for observers, civil society groups, political entities to be somehow engaged in that process with the IEC, so that they can say it's not just one assessment, but what do local communities think? Are there areas that can be secured? Are there areas where polling stations can be moved? I think opening that process to a more transparent one can help to balance the tension that Scott described between opening up too many polling stations in insecure areas where maybe fraud can occur, or closing down stations that disenfranchises people. Getting a common kind of consensus agreement that involves Afghan society on where polling stations should be, I think, is a big opportunity for a more credible process.
Thank you all very much. So 1 year to go, lots of challenges, but also I hope, certainly I took away from this conversation that there's also lots of opportunities. And I think the point that has been raised, I think let's not set the bar too low. It's going to become, let's not be so skeptical too, because that can become self-fulfilling. If we don't think it can happen, we're not going to adequately prepare. But there are opportunities. We are focusing on this, as Scott pointed out, well ahead of where the norm in Afghanistan. We have 1 year to go, which doesn't sound like a lot of time, but the good news is it's a lot more time than we've had in some of the previous elections in terms of preparation. I think, from my perspective, again, really important that some of our own messaging changes. I mean, as Nader said, every night in Kabul and Afghanistan, this is what many Afghans are talking about. This is what the media is talking about. Many of the political elites have done extremely well in the last decade in Afghanistan, and a very strong vested interest in trying to make sure that the country doesn't fall apart. And so having a successful, legitimate transition of political power next year is in their interests. And that's another reason why I think I'm optimistic that it can happen. And I think it's also a real opportunity for the U.S. and our international partners to change some of our messaging, that it's not about how do we get out of Afghanistan as quickly as possible, to the opportunity to have a democratic transition, which is the very best way, I think, to even protect our interests in Afghanistan, of a relatively stable Afghanistan moving forward. So again, I see it as a time of opportunity, and I wanted to thank all of you for coming, and also to thank our panelists very much for, now they're coming a very long way, Hosai and the two Scots, for excellent presentations. And last but not least, to thank Emily Horan, who is the person who actually organizes all these and does all the hard work while we sit up here and just pontificate. So thank you all very much. Thank you.